Greetings, students of the Force, and welcome to the Archives. This is the first time we've ever made a video of this length and this scale, so I truly and sincerely hope that you enjoy. Part 1. The Second Great Schism. The Exiles, the Outcasts, the Dark Jedi, the Gen Jedi. They went by many names, but most of us are more familiar with the name that they would become. The Sith. They were the first, the originals, the founders. Their actions would birth an order of Dark Lords that would turn the power of evil itself into an art form, one that each of them would master. But as we pursued our vast archives, we found that as often as we mentioned the Dark Jedi, the 100-Year Darkness, there is still so much to be discovered. Our coverage of these individuals and their acts are scattered amongst too many of our holocrons, and although the story of the Second Great Schism and the subsequent founding of the Sith Order of Korriban is famous, we know shockingly little about the actual order of events, and less about each of the founding Dark Jedi. Despite their fame, or their infamy, they are each shrouded in complete mystery. So in today's recording, we have undertaken the task of compiling absolutely everything there is to know about the original 12 Dark Jedi, the original 12 Sith. We plan on retelling each of the events in strenuous detail, as well as uncovering each of the Dark Lords themselves. Now it should be noted that when we say that they are shrouded in mystery, we mean it. Just about everything we know about the original 12 has never been told in any official story, but is given to us through secondhand accounts and anecdotes. We have done a lot of the heavy lifting in connecting seemingly unconnected events and historical characters to paint a complete picture of not only what happened, but who it involved. The secrets of the Sith are about to be laid bare before us, so get comfortable, grab something to eat, because today we will be exploring the origin of evil. The first 12 Lords of the Sith. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. There have been many Sith kings throughout the history of Korriban, but before Ajunta Pall, there has never been one to claim the mantle or the title of Sith Lord. Before all of that, he was a Jedi, like so many others from the Jedi Order. The year was 7000 BBY, and though knowledge of this period is scarce on Ajunta and his time as a Jedi, we do know that Ajunta Pall achieved the rank of Jedi Master before he embraced the dark side. Ajunta Pall had been fascinated with the study of mysteries of the Force, ready to ponder the greatest depths that it had to offer. To this end, he had looked to the ancient past of when the Order was young, and had once called themselves the Jedi. It was in these at the time even ancient studies where Ajunta Pall would discover the art of alchemy. In this era, the Jedi maintained a balance between the light and the dark side, what they called the Ashla and the Bogan. The Jedi actually used the practice of Force alchemy quite liberally. In fact, they had an entire temple on Tython dedicated to it, known as the Anil Kesh. They used this to merge their kyber crystals with their metal blades, creating powerful swords connected directly to the Force using this alchemy. But they also used alchemy to create and manipulate life. Most famously, the Jedi had tamed rancors and used alchemy to give them wings. During the Force War with the Infinite Empire, the Jedi had ridden these flying rancors into battle against the Rakata. But long before moving to the world of Ossus and rebranding themselves as the Jedi, the Order had ceased the practice of alchemy entirely. They did this because the Jedi were meant to be guardians of life, not manipulators of it. Ajunta Pall, though, did not see things similarly. Ajunta believed that as beings who could touch the Force, it was their duty to master it in all of its aspects. He delved deeply into alchemy and began twisting life behind closed doors. This opened the gateway into the dark side itself, where he would use terrible new powers. Ajunta amassed a large following within the Jedi Order, those who did not want to give up alchemy, those who thought similarly. They all knew what the Jedi would do, that they would never approve of what they were doing, what they were studying, so they needed to act in secret. Ajunta and his new followers had been inspired deeply by the story of the First Great Schism. During those events, which had occurred nearly 17 millennia prior to them, a Jedi by the name of Xendor had broken off from the Order and had formed his own group known as the Legions of Leto. However, the histories had been silent on Xendor's true personality and the reasons for leaving the Jedi. The reality that was not recorded was that Xendor himself was a respectful man who wanted peace with the Jedi, but was forced into a war that he never wanted. But Ajunta and his followers only remembered him for his bold heresy, a brave rebellion against the status quo. By now it was said that the Dark Jedi had the power of life itself at their fingertips, and they were drunk with that power. That was until their secret was unearthed. The Jedi denounced Ajunta Pall's teachings as an abomination, an affront to the Force itself. They deemed that all of it should be erased at once, and declared Ajunta Pall a pawn of the dark side. But before the Jedi could make good on their judgment, the Dark Jedi struck first. Ajunta Pall drew his sword and murdered his Jedi Master as a testament to his rejection of the Jedi way, and then he called for his followers to rally against the Jedi oppressors. In reaction, the Jedi Order took up arms against this new threat, the Jedi themselves. This was the Second Great Schism, the beginning of the darkness. At least a third of the Jedi Order would follow Ajunta Pall, and a war would begin which echoed into the very reaches of time. Many people confused the Second Great Schism as being the name of the war, but this was simply the term given to the moment the Jedi Order was torn between the light and the dark. The name of the war is the 100-Year Darkness. As the chilling title suggests, this war did indeed last 100 years, from the year 7000 to 6900 BBY. The Dark Jedi and the Jedi battled across the galaxy in a grueling war of attrition. The Jedi attempted to crush these dissidents with the same efficiency that they had during the First Great Schism, a war which began and ended in a single year of fighting. However, they met an unexpected amount of resistance from their fallen brothers, who had turned out to be far more powerful than the Jedi had anticipated. Although rudimentary, their abilities in the dark side unmastered, it did boost their already staggering skill. As the journals of another fallen 12 would say, Sorzus Syn writes that they had been the finest Jedi of the Republic. While this is of course coming from a place of classic dark side arrogance, the histories show us that there was merit behind this writing. There was no way that they could have lasted 100 years against the Jedi Order if they had previously not been the Order's most powerful. One question many wonder is though, how did they even live long enough to fight for an entire century? Well, to keep themselves in good vitality for a century-long war, Ajunta Pall and his followers used the alchemical practices on themselves to maintain their own lives. As for the Jedi, you have several long-lived masters such as Ud Banar, who was from the Nedi species, a race of tree-like people who have lifespans of thousands of years. It's likely that these types of masters will oversee the training of the next few generations of Jedi, raising them to fight against their fallen brethren in the 100-Year Darkness. Though ironically, the 100-Year Darkness for all of its length of time is the Jedi War that we unfortunately know the least about. What we do know is that by the end of it, the Jedi had made efforts to purge all mention of it and the Dark Jedi from the galaxy, so very few records of the battle have existed. The little scraps of knowledge we have are based out of offhanded mentions in the journals of Sorzus Syn and bits of evidence that have been left behind. But even with this, Sorzus Syn only dedicates a single page to the 100-year-long war. We know that during the 100-Year Darkness, the all-involved likely used proto-lightsabers, as that is all that was invented. These were the archaic precursors to the lightsaber, weapons intended to produce an energy blade that was connected to a cable to an external power pack worn on one's belt. There are painted depictions of the Dark Jedi of this time using free-hilted red lightsabers, but these are historically inaccurate, and was just done for a dramatized visualization of the Dark Jedi's power. Modern lightsaber technology was not invented until after the 100-Year Darkness, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. We also believe that the second form of lightsaber combat, Makashi, saw development and creation during this 100-Year Darkness. Makashi had been created many years after the First Great Schism, when the Jedi needed to develop a form that was specifically meant to duel with other lightsaber-wielding enemies. When they graduated from metal swords to proto-sabers, they needed a more practical blade-to-blade style, but they never suspected that they'd have to use it against their own brothers. For 100 years, Form 2 was the primary lightsaber form used by Jedi and Dark Jedi alike. In this day, only Forms 1 and 2 existed, as blaster technology had not yet become readily available in the galaxy yet, meaning that the all-defensive Form 3 was not yet developed yet. This meant that every saber combatant exclusively used Form 2, making all of them exceptional duelists for the era. And they had also repeated the in-life practice of situations for literally 100 years. We may say that the saber wielders of the 100-Year Darkness were some of the finest lightsaber duelists in all of Jedi history, simply because of how often they were doing it. This goes along with what Traya was telling us in the Knights of the Old Republic games, when she said that Jedi and Sith alike were children playing with toys when compared to the old saber masters. On the side of the Dark Jedi, this would give rise to a mysterious armored warrior who would go on to become one of the greatest lightsaber duelist that the galaxy would ever see. One of our favorite Sith Lords, and who we believe may just be the best duelist in the entirety of the lore. But we will go into this beast in just a moment. But first, we have to talk about the rest of the Exiles. But going on, without blaster technology being a thing at the time, and Form 2 only really being effective in one-on-one duels, the Dark Jedi needed weapons of mass destruction to kill enemies on a mass scale. And to do this, they flexed their new powers in the dark side, alchemically creating plagues and what is known as Sith war beasts, but at the time, just known as war beasts. It was here where Sorzus Syn would get her spotlight. She was the first to create these horrific monsters. They were known as Shamblers, the Howlers, and Pit Horrors. We know next to nothing about any of these creatures though, but they are inconsequential compared to their culmination. Using everything that she had learned from her previous creations, Syn would devise gargantuan monsters that she called Leviathans. We can basically identify these beings as living superweapons. They were grown from the dark side of the Force, and could interfere with the senses of Force sensitives, making them hear screams, develop large headaches, and then trigger maddening effects, obsessive behavior in the victims. They were madness incarnate. But the true power of the Leviathans came when they killed an enemy. The victim's spirit would be swallowed and their life energy stored into one of the beast's skin blisters. These hulking behemoths killed dozens of Jedi in their day and led to several Dark Jedi victories. One particular Leviathan, named Buckley, the Ever-Hungry, became Sorzus Syn's favorite. Many millennia later, it would be Grandmaster Yoda who would comment that it is unbearable to see a creature changed in such a horrific way. So much so that ending their lives would be considered a mercy. For a war to have lasted as long as this one did, and for the Dark Jedi to have been able to stand up against the Jedi forces and the Republic, they were going to need more than just a cult and monsters. It was mentioned that they had ground forces known as the Black Legions. These were led by Remulus Dreypa. We believe that these were possible slave soldiers from conquered worlds, but we want to focus on the Dark Jedi's fleet, which they would have needed against the Republic, as it was confirmed in Sorzus Syn journal that the Dark Jedi did have a fleet here, a fleet that was led by another Dark Jedi exile, Karness Muur. But our question is, where could the Dark Jedi possibly have got a fleet? We believe that it was entirely possible that the Dark Jedi had control of the Starforge, the superweapon built by the ancient Rakata and later used by Darth Revan and Darth Malak. For those of you unfamiliar with this horrifying structure, it was a space station which drew upon the Force and the energy of stars in order to create endless supplies of ships, droids, and materials for war. It was more than likely that Ajunta Pall and the Dark Jedi gained control of the Starforge, as the Knights of the Old Republic video game actually hints that it did in fact happen this way. In the game, Revan has a conversation with the spirit of Ajunta, who remembers very little of his life at this time, but he does say this: "We were not the first to fall to the dark side, but we had more power than those before us. It came from elsewhere. Our oldest secret. Only we would know. We lords. Only we would know where our power came from. It is a secret from so long ago, I no longer remember. You, who bristle with the Force, you must find this place. I see your heart, human Jedi. I see your power, your pride. You will find the old place, the dark place, and you will regret it. Or have you? Or did you? Or will you?" Ajunta is nearly certainly speaking of the Starforge here with Revan. Darth Vitiate had been known to send Revan and Malak to find the weapon in the first place. But how would Ajunta have known this? The Starforge was a Rakatan weapon, not located anywhere near Sith space. Vitiate was a scholar, and would have studied the accounts left by the Dark Jedi exiles. But Ajunta speaks of it as their oldest secret, a place where they gained all of their power. In order for the exiles to fight this war with the Jedi for so long, they had to have harnessed its strength to supply their ground and space forces. But apparently at some point during the war, the exiles would lose the Starforge, either losing control of it or losing the knowledge of its whereabouts. It's likely around this time that the tides of the war began to shift and turned in favor of the Jedi Order. One thing we do know about the 100-Year Darkness, before we talk about its individual battles, is the Prism. Apparently, the Jedi High Council constructed a prison world for individuals that fell to the dark side. They called this the Prism, and it was secretly only known to members of the High Council throughout Jedi history. No one else. It was a prison space station located in wild space, having been constructed in the mass shadow of the 6th moon of Diab. Diab's electrical storms wreaked havoc with sensors, and no transmissions were allowed in or out of the prison. The prison was an inescapable, self-sustaining mechanism, and had a skeleton crew of 100 security droids and a single Jedi Master. However, the prison didn't seem to have ever been used during the war, but it was constructed for the purpose of housing war criminals, though it was rediscovered by Obi-Wan Kenobi during the Clone Wars. Now, as for the battles that were actually fought during the 100-Year Darkness, we know close to nothing besides maybe 6 of them. One was known as the Trap of Fluwaka, wherein the Jedi and the Republic had set an ambush for the Dark Jedi's forces. However, due to the clever fleet strategizing and quick thinking of Karness Muur, the Fallen were able to prevent the trap from succeeding. Another one of our favorite battles is the Battle of Balmorra, another Dark Jedi victory, and perhaps the first appearance of the Leviathans in lore. Sorzus Syn recalls having the hulking monsters to splinter Jedi barricades during this conflict. Coruscant seems to have been another staging ground and a core world where they fought. Several of the Exiles make mention of Coruscant later on, and there have been many conflicts on Alderaan and Rafa 5, as one of the Exiles was buried with a lightsaber crystal that he had claimed from both of these worlds, meaning that the 100-Year Darkness came here as well. But the greatest and the most notable skirmish was the Battle of Korbos. Korbos saw the final defeat of Ajunta Pall's followers, and the official ending to the 100-Year Darkness. Korbos seemed to have been the last stand in a string of devastating defeats for the Dark Jedi, as they had lost all of their worlds until that point, with Korbos being their final stronghold. The fighting began in orbit, until the Dark Jedi were forced to the ground. The Black Legion was overwhelmed by forces of the Republic, and it came down to strictly Jedi versus Dark Jedi. The winner take all. Sorzus Syn later made snide comments about Karness Muur's leadership during this battle, wishing that he had shown some ingenuity at Korbos, as he had done in earlier battles, and Sorzus Syn outright blamed their defeat on Remulus Dreypa, refusing to accept any accountability. She attempted to unleash the full might of her Leviathans, or at least what she had left of them, but the Republic vessels in orbit were ready, and they shot down each of her Leviathans. The ranks of the Dark Jedi thinned, as they were simply outnumbered by the Jedi Order, until there were only 12 of them left, and they were forced to officially surrender. The Jedi, so confident in their triumph, did not execute us. With lightsaber points at our backs, they marched us aboard the galleon that would take us into exile, outside the Republic's borders. A quote from the Journal of Sorzus Syn: only 12 of them were left from Korbos and sent into banishment. In what may be one of the greatest blunders in the Jedi Order's history, they did not execute the traitors. They didn't have the heart to. But as punishment for their high treason, the Jedi simply exiled them into uncharted territories of space. And while this seems incredibly stupid on the part of the Jedi, we have to remember that many of the knights that were fighting during the End Days were not the same Jedi who were present in the beginning of the 100-Year Darkness. The Jedi that exiled them were much younger, having grown up in a time of war. This was pretty much an everyday occurrence for them. For the Jedi, the ending of the war was just as historic as the beginning of it, as their masters' masters had been fighting it before they had. This generation of Jedi would have been more compassionate, knowing that the Jedi way was not to kill unarmed enemies, but to simply let the forces be done with them, and then let the will of the Force dictate their fate. And dictate it did. In favor of the Jedi though, shooting them off into uncharted space was akin to a death sentence in this day. Hyperspace technology was crude and required a beacon at the destination of jump to reliably navigate hyperlanes, since navicomputers and droids did not yet have the processing power to do hyperspace calculations themselves yet. Back in this era, hyperspace explorers would chart hyperlanes by making carefully calculated micro jumps and plotting it on a map physically. When safe and useful lanes were discovered, the Republic would dispatch space stations to serve as the purpose of a lighthouse and beacons that could be charted and followed. These beacons would keep the lanes open and serve as a connection point to send hyperspace jump coordinates to navicomputers trying to use that lane. But since much of wild space in this day was uncharted, and there were no beacons out there anywhere, hyperspace jumps would likely end in disaster. To put it simply, the Jedi assumed that their enemies would float in the endless void of space until they wasted away into nothingness. A more fitting punishment for these people who sought glory in murder and death. But what the Jedi did not know was that the Dark Jedi did have a destination in mind. And as for a jump beacon, they had no need for one. The dark side would be their guide. For years during the war, the Dark Jedi had another secret. Sorzus Syn had been carefully searching the galaxy for the legendary homeworld of a species known as Sith, a species sparsely mentioned in the ancient Jedi texts. Sorzus Syn had extracted information from refugees and cataloged rumors, searching for proof of the kingdom of the Sith, and if it did indeed exist, or was merely dark side legend. Soon though, her beliefs would be vindicated, as what lay before them was a limitless pool of steadfast warriors and untapped knowledge in the dark side. You see though, the Dark Jedi had all been using the dark side for 100 years at this point, but they had never really refined it. They, in this time, could still very much be considered the students, and had not yet mastered even a small fraction of what the dark side offered. In fact, they pioneered much of what we know about the dark side today. But for them, it was just as much as uncharted territory as their banishment was. But the legends of the Sith purebloods told them that there were those out there in the galaxy that had mastered the ways of the dark side fully, or at least begun to, and that their knowledge was precious and was waiting to be mined. Sorzus navigated their derelict starship through hyperspace and through the Stygian caldera. This was a nebula which surrounded the area that we know as Sith space. The Stygian caldera acted as a breakwater, a natural defense of this part of the galaxy. No one is able to find their way through it without the dark side of the Force as their ally and guide. For this reason, navigators have found no true routes into Sith space, only blind jumps. The first charted Sith hyperlane into Sith space was known as the Dragon Tail, and it went up through the southernmost region of the Stygian caldera. And what planet would be the doormat of all Sith space, except for Korriban itself? This was the hyperspace beacon, felt only through the Force to those that could hear the call and beckon of the dark side. And now we have reached the second part of our story. Part 2. Exile. The Journal of Sorzus Syn continues to guide us. She writes this: "We touch down on Korriban, the world that screams the loudest for those that can hear the dark side's voice. It is on Korriban that the Sith purebloods began. It is here that they often return in death. We stepped out of the cramped reek of our interstellar prison into the light of an unfamiliar sun. Grand tombs carved from the planet's stone surrounded us, the sand littered with the bones of thousands of kings. According to her records, what came next was finally the meeting of the Sith people and the Dark Jedi Exiles, the 12. Sorzus Syn writes that they greeted the Dark Jedi with open arms, which I must say I find to be quite interesting given the Sith's history with outsiders. It is likely that they sensed the familiar storm of the dark side within these 12 new arrivals. The Exiles would display their superior power and knowledge in the dark side, but the Sith people didn't immediately hail them as gods or rulers. After all, the purebloods had generations of their own kings who wielded similarly impressive power, not to mention that these outsiders didn't know their language. What proceeded in the next several weeks were the Dark Jedi began to do their homework in learning all they could about Sith culture. And after this, they would find out how to undermine their power structure, put themselves at the top of the hierarchy. But I believe that now that this would be a great time to talk about each of the Exiles themselves. Who were the 12? What were they doing during this time? And do we even know all 12 of their names? Well, after much intense research, we have been able to narrow down exactly who 8 out of the 12 of them were. In her journal, Sorzus Syn only mentions 5 Dark Jedi by name, and considers the rest to be virtually unremarkable. She says that only other less distinguished Dark Jedi were prominent within the company, simply because they had not perished in the war. They were not leaders. But we believe that this is either through arrogance or Sorzus Syn's jealousy talking, as there were certainly a few distinguished members that she did not choose to mention. Let's begin from the top. The first Exile, number 1, Ajunta Pall. Though of course we must begin with the first Dark Lord himself. We covered exactly who he was in detail in the beginning of this video, but in this brand new era, Ajunta was known as the High General, and was acknowledged as the leader of the 12 Dark Jedi. All of his followers either feared or greatly respected and revered him, and despite their failure against the Jedi forces, the Exiles still considered Ajunta their fearless leader. He allowed Sorzus Syn to take the lead on finding Korriban, and let her spearhead the operation of actually learning about the Sith purebloods. However, Ajunta remained in command of all of those, and any of her research would be for his own benefit to keep himself on top. Ajunta Pall was cemented as the best duelist and fighter of this era, bar one other. and the strongest in terms of raw force abilities. Though as we continue to learn, we will discover that there were Dark Jedi that grew more powerful than Ajunta would. But we'll get into that later. Ajunta was the instigator of the entire rebellion originally. He was old, and he had doubtlessly worked himself to the bone to ensure that they stayed in paramount condition. All the Dark Jedi and Sith respected was power above anything, and I have absolutely no reservations about stating that Ajunta kept himself in the lead by firmly establishing himself as the strongest. While we don't have any accurate summary of his specific abilities, we don't really need them. All we know is that his power was enough to keep his treacherous followers in line, and he remained undefeated throughout the 100-year darkness and combat. And as we will go on to find out, his power was quite substantial. For the first few weeks on Korriban, the Dark Jedi waited. Ajunta waited for one event specifically, Sorzus deciphering the Sith language and learning their power structure. He then set his sights on the current reigning Sith king, a king by the name of Hakagam Grosh. Ajunta then gained the trust of Grosh's Shadow Hand, who was, in essence, the second in command of the entire Sith kingdom of that day. With his help, the Dark Jedi General lured Hakagam Grosh into a trap, where Ajunta publicly challenged him to a duel. As the king of the war-obsessed Sith purebloods, Hakagam Grosh was no slouch when it came to combat, but the odds were stacked against him meticulously. His opponent was one of the greatest Jedi of the era who had embraced the dark side. With sword skills honed over a century of non-stop war and perpetual maintenance of leadership among a crowd of bloodthirsty individuals and warriors themselves, the Sith King never stood a chance, and he was swiftly defeated. Ajunta would quickly claim the Sith King's sword for his very own. The weapon was a staff with 2 forearm-length blades at each end. The blade required great skill to wield, and was not a regular weapon for common soldiers, as we'll later discover, and it appears as if the war sword of Hakagam Grosh may have actually been cursed, but it was certainly enchanted with Sith alchemy, as all Sith weapons were. Ajunta would go on to torture the Sith King with his own weapon before beheading him publicly. The purebloods marveled not just at the Dark Jedi's abilities, but their power to destroy their king swiftly, who they had perceived as invincible. This is what caused them to believe that Ajunta and the 11 were actually Sith gods, ones much stronger than any king that had come before, bar maybe 1 or 2. The Sith pureblood known as the Kasai priests revered each of the 12 as different manifestations of the deities of the Dark Sith pantheon, referring to Ajunta as Typhogem, the left-handed god. Typhogem in the Sith mythology was the king of their gods and was a great destroyer. From this point on, the 12 Dark Jedi took on the collective name of the Jedi, a word from the Sith language which directly translates to Dark Jedi. Ajunta himself decided to take the title of the Jedi, which in Sith tongue meant Dark Lord. Ajunta was fully aware of the title of the Sith Ari and the legend of King Adis, as once it was discovered by Sorzus Syn, he too was fascinated with this old legend. The tale told of a Sith king so great, so fearsome and powerful, that he became a godlike figure. But he was for real. We won't go too in depth about King Adis today since we've done several holocrons and videos about him before, but what's important to know is that his legacy spawned the prophecy of the Sith Chosen One. The title of the Sith Ari was certainly one that the Jedi could have used to great advantage in their empire. However, they actively chose not to. The 12 feared that such a move would drastically backfire on them because of how sacred King Adis was to their people, and so Ajunta wisely decided to leave the title of the Sith Ari alone. But we'll talk about the conquest of the Jedi in just a moment. But now, let's move on to the second of the Exiles. Number 2, Sorzus Syn. We've mentioned Sorzus a lot, mostly because of the majority of the events are told from her perspective. But she's also one of the most important Jedi, because she's responsible for pushing the development of the Sith and the Dark Jedi society forward. We believe that Sorzus Syn was a native of Coruscant. She makes a lot of references to it in her writings, mentioning Coruscant marketplaces, citizens, and building spires on more than one occasion. Of all the Dark Jedi fascinated with Ajunta's discovery of alchemy, it was Sorzus Syn that was most devoted to the talent of all of them. She was the chief conjurer and chief alchemist during the war, and as we mentioned at length beforehand, she was responsible for all of the monsters that the Dark Jedi had used. She doesn't claim to be very high-ranking within the hierarchy of the Dark Jedi during the war though, but her prestige was quickly boosted post-Exile, since she was the one that had found Korriban in the first place. She was known as the scholar of the group, and through her work, it is often either overlooked, unfortunately, by the other Gen Jedi, or outright taken advantage of. Based on how she mentions the other Dark Jedi laying claim to artifacts that she found, it doesn't appear that she offers much resistance to them, likely because her own combat prowess is a bit lacking compared to the others. But her strengths lie in the mind, and in the realm of intellect among the 12, she is undefeated. Her writings make it clear that she desires to overthrow Ajunta and to take the position as the Dark Lord, but she doesn't exactly write her plans to do this. From the moment she landed on Korriban, she made it her goal to understand the Sith space, and the treasures that awaited them in that realm. Her first recordings were all about the Sith people themselves, their biological makeup, their society, their strict caste system, and even their weapons and poisons. It was clear from her writings that she greatly admired the Sith people despite their primitivism. Their advancements in the dark side was clear for all to see, and even Sidious many years later held a great respect for his ancestral people, from whence the order was derived. In the dusty tombs of the Sith kings, Sorzus Syn discovered many treasures, amulets, objects of power that aided the Dark Jedi in their journey for greater power and enlightenment. One of her favorite objects was known as the Sith Avatar. This relic translates any language spoken or written and will attune it to the wearer, adding the maddening chatter of dead ghosts. Using the Avatar, she gained a mastery of the Sith tongue and was able to teach it to her fellow Dark Jedi in weeks. Sorzus was responsible for mapping out the local hyperlanes as well, plotting the courses to other planets in the Stygian caldera. She discovered how the ziggurat-shaped Sith temples actually functioned, and how they channeled the power of the dark side towards the epicenter of the tomb. She was a genius, and during her long life she would craft 3 amulets of power. The first was known as the Muur Talisman, an object created at the request of Karness Muur. This is probably one of the most powerful Sith artifacts ever created, and we'll go into more detail about it later when we get to Karness Muur. The second amulet was crafted for Remulus Dreypa, Muur's rival. It had a similar amount of power, which of course was placed there intentionally. Syn decided to do this so that the two would battle each other ceaselessly, keeping them distracted from her plotting. And in Dreypa's amulet, she had snuck in a secret component. It was intended to trap his spirit once he died in combat. Just a little failsafe for the future when she would become the Dark Lord. She had always hated him. And then, we get the third talisman, an amulet that she made for herself. We don't actually know the specifications or the power of this object, as she strangely does not divulge any of it. But she claims that it is far stronger than the others. Because she doesn't mention it again though, we have no idea whether its creation was successful or not. But she did make the previous 2, so it's likely that we can assume that she was successful in making the third. By only her 7th day on Korriban, Sorzus had penetrated the sanctum of XoXaan, a sacred tomb which was laid undisturbed for more than 10,000 years because of its dangerous booby traps. It brimmed with vile wonders, such as hundreds of scrolls detailing all of Sith alchemy, as well as held the preserved body of a Terminus. Most impressive of all though, was the holocron of King Nakgru. From that, Sorzus Syn discovered not only how to make a Sith holocron of her own, but she learned the entire history of the pure-blooded people. Her understanding of alchemy was thrust into untold achievement and advancement. She learned not only how to make war beasts more efficiently, but how to enhance weapons and artifacts. In her own journal, she wrote this: "I was the greatest of the master summoners who fought in the 100-Year Darkness. My inspirations came from me in rumors and dreams. And only now, in the minaret of Ziost, do I realize it was the call of the Sith all along. Sith alchemists have had ages to perfect their art, and their knowledge is now all mine." She was actually learning so much so quickly that the holocron guardian of the king grew jealous of her learning and refused to teach her about Sith incantations. So Sorzus cast her net wider, as well as spell casting, submerged in the bloody slurry of Mongrel Altar. In fact, one of these scrolls unleashed a curse on her when she opened it, but she found that the more that she fought off the visions of terror, blindness, and rage that the Sith spirits screamed at her, the more valuable the information that she found within the scrolls. She went on to become a master spellcaster and alchemist, spending nearly all of her time in the temples of Ziost. The minaret was basically her own wizard's tower, where she studied and perfected her experiments. But perhaps the greatest thing that Sorzus Syn ever contributed to the Sith Order was the Sith Code itself. Indeed, Sorzus Syn was the writer of these lines. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power I gain victory. Through victory my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. Her inspiration was the philosophy of strength that the Sith people lived and died by. She stated that the Sith don't really need a unifying mantra to remind them of how they live, as they simply take whatever they can, kill what they do not need, and use everything to its fullest. They are ruled by the fittest model of what the dark side can achieve. However, Sorzus Syn desired to create a code of her own order of teachings, one to point out the failings of the Jedi Code. In the words of Sorzus Syn, peace, serenity, and harmony are the restraints of the same thing, the passive acceptance of limitations. The Jedi encourage this, but passion will always defeat peace. And now we reach our third exile, number 3, Karness Muur. Let us begin with a quote. And though the enemy brought great numbers on the field of battle, for every number there is a negative. Their strength became my own. Their minds became my own. All flesh is my flesh. None move, save I will it. This is the rule that the Sith were promised, and I have made it real. This was a quote from the Codex of Karness Muur, a manifesto written by the man himself and later translated by Naga Sadow. Muur is likely one of the most problematic of the Exiles, and certainly one of the most power-hungry. He had a slimy and manipulative way about him that helped him get what he wanted out of others, but he was certainly intelligent, or at least clever in the realm of battle. Originally, he was the fleet admiral of the Dark Jedi's navy, as stated by Sorzus Syn, and it was because of his tactical wisdom that they reversed the trap of Fluaka. Karness Muur may be credited with being one of the first beings to wield the modern lightsaber as well. Following the 100-Year Darkness, it was the Sith that would be the ones to improve upon the design of the proto-sabers, including an internal power cell. An internal superconductor was then introduced, which transferred the returning loop energy from the negative charged flux adapter back into the internal power cell. With this modification, the power cell would only extend energy when the loop was broken, such as when a lightsaber cut something, solving the power supply issue. We aren't entirely sure which of the Exiles were the first to officially construct the modern lightsaber, but we do know that Karness Muur designed for himself a couple red-bladed weapons, one of which even had a curved hilt design. He was also one of the few who discovered the way of using alchemy, creating synthetic red lightsaber crystals in place of natural kyber crystals. Going even further, we can also accredit the design of the double-bladed lightsaber to the Jedi as well. While we don't know if it was one of them that constructed it during the 100-Year Darkness or later, or even if one was ever constructed during this era whatsoever, we do know that the schematics for the double-bladed lightsaber were designed by the original 12 Exiles. We know this because it was from an ancient Sith holocron that XoXaan would get the schematics to build his own saber staff, likely being the first saber staff ever constructed, but based on ancient schematics. We know that it had to have been one of the Exiles, because the Dark Lords between the Exiles and Naga Sadow all used swords. In fact, the Jedi were the only ancient Sith to ever use lightsabers, so it had to be one of them. Back to Karness Muur, his real claim to fame was the Muur Talisman, one of the most powerful artifacts in history that we mentioned earlier. Designed by Sorzus Syn at Muur's request, it would go on to be the reason that he would outlive all of the other 12. The talisman was the finest triumph of Syn's mastery of alchemy. Primarily, it had the function of being able to transform the feeble-minded into beasts known as Rakghouls, under the complete control of the wearer of the amulet. Rakghouls were a type of Sith-spawn mutant, engineered by Karness Muur himself. Hideous and possessing an appetite for flesh, Rakghouls were one-eyed, hunched-over troglodytes with huge claws and razor-sharp teeth. They were often mindless, non-sentient creatures with no hint of who they once were. If one were ever to suffer a bite or a scratch, they would come down with the Rakghoul plague, a sickness also engineered by Karness Muur. The plague would quickly turn painful, transforming the victim into a Rakghoul under the control of the amulet. With the amulet in hand, Karness Muur had an army of horrendous creatures perpetually at his command. But the secondary, and the most important function of the Muur Talisman, was that it could preserve the wearer's essence within it upon their death. effectively granting them spiritual immortality. Karness poured all of his power and evil into the charm, ensuring that his spirit was imprinted upon it so that he would be kept alive even after he fell in battle. It was this single function that would cause the amulet to become one of the most notorious objects in all of Sith history. And now, our next exile emerges. The fourth of the group, Baron Remulus Dreypa. The Baron had been the commander of the Black Legion, the ground forces of the Dark Jedi during the 100-Year Darkness. At some point, it seems that he had a fleet of his own, or at least was in charge of one next to Karness Muur. Either way, Sorzus Syn mentions him having a fleet and experience, which aided in her plotting the course through Sith space. Remulus Dreypa was a hot-headed and a violent brute of a man who believed that the true Sith should only care for themselves. It was to him that caring for others would weaken the Sith, and was actually a form of slavery. Having said that though, he did have a lustful eye, which found its mark on a particular Sith priestess. When Sorzus Syn discovered that she could use the Sith's blood to permit alchemical crossbreeding, she was so excited to inform Remulus Dreypa of this because she knew of his infatuation with the priestess. This was mainly because Remulus Dreypa, who was of course a baron, had a bloodline of nobility, and was concerned that his lineage would die out with him. It didn't exactly sit well with Remulus that the Gen Jedi were remaining in the Sith space for this long. He began to view his colleagues as complacent to the rule, and he called them mongrels in exile. As the years dragged on, he began to absolutely loathe Sith space and the Stygian caldera altogether. He saw it as a cage rather than a kingdom, and he believed that it was his right to rule the stars themselves. This sentiment would soon cause a rift much later on. Remulus also seemed to have a working friendship, or at least tolerated alliance with Sorzus Syn. She not only informed him of the crossbreeding discovery, but also supplied him with his own amulet in order to fight off the Muur talisman. Baron Dreypa and Karness Muur were bitter rivals, and always attempted to formulate plots to catch the other in traps. The talisman Syn gave to him didn't have the Rakghoul property as Muur's did, but it shared the same ability of preserving his life essence should he fall in combat. But like we mentioned earlier, Sorzus Syn had cleverly input the ability to trap his spirit rather than preserving it. And yet, Remulus quickly discovered this deception, but rather than acting in revenge, he simply retooled his amulet, causing it to preserve his life and his sanity for an extended period of time. He also decided to slight Sorzus Syn in a more subtle way. While retooling his amulet, he gave it the power to enslave her beloved Leviathans under his command, and he would even steal some of the most prized Leviathan larvae for himself. Much of his exploits happen later on in the story, so we'll be covering that shortly. As for his power, we see him demonstrate the kind of abilities in the Force that only the Gen Jedi could command. He could call bolts of lightning down from the sky on command on a whim, bolts strong enough to dust large buildings. He could also direct tidal waves of fire to consume his enemies. This was the average kind of power wielded by the 12. And of course keep in mind that Ajunta was said to be beyond any of them. But now we have reached the 5th exile, a strange, gaunt, ghostly figure, Martynas XoXaan. XoXaan is the last of the exiles explicitly named in Sorzus Syn's journal. We don't really know much about her species, or what kind of nobility she had, despite her being a Martynas. Most of the other 12 we can identify as human-based beings, purely based on appearance, but XoXaan is one of the only Dark Jedi that we can't actually be sure is human. She had extremely pale white skin, odd black markings on her face, which are likely tattoos of some kind. They are not Sith in origin, but maybe from her own people. She was one of the commanders of the Black Legions alongside Remulus Dreypa, and would have been a Jedi Guardian at one point. Something else that's unfortunate is we don't have a lot of information of what she was doing during her exile, besides an account from Sorzus Syn who was complaining about her, stating that after discovering the Yoke of Seeming, that XoXaan stubbornly seized it for herself. The Yoke of Seeming was a powerful amulet found in one of the tombs of Korriban. Apparently it was a golden armature that burns the skin through illusions that make the wearer appear as anyone or anything they want. Other than this, the Martynas is distinguished by one feat alone, being one of the few Darksiders in history to have discovered a pathway to healing. Dark healing is one of the most elusive powers of the dark side. This side of the Force doesn't have a whole lot to do with life, so healing is not one of the tenets innately given to its practitioners. This was a major advantage in the Jedi path. Darth Bane actually thought it was impossible to achieve healing through the dark side whatsoever. But Bane was proven wrong by a very tight handful of Sith who have actually managed to achieve it. Usually, dark healing is done through Sith magic, and almost always comes with a terrible price. But it appears that XoXaan perfected the art of healing, setting her apart from the other 12. We know that she recorded her knowledge in a holocron and squirreled it away, keeping it hidden from her colleagues. There is also a distinct possibility that XoXaan and Ajunta got together and were actually married. We say this because Marka Ragnos is stated to have been a direct descendant of the original Exiles, specifically Ajunta Pall. Sorzus Syn never married anyone, and so XoXaan, as one of the only other female Exiles, has to be a candidate. There is one other female Exile, but XoXaan's popularity amongst the Dark Jedi, her knowledge, and her seemingly high rank likely is what contributed to her and Ajunta getting together. But now we reach 6, my favorite of the original 12, Tulak Hord. This may come to a surprise to many of you, but according to several very strong pieces of evidence, Tulak Hord was one of the Dark Jedi Exiles. What's compelling though, is we do know for a fact that he was never a Jedi Knight, so his origins are mysterious, more so than the other 12. But it seemed that he arrived to the side of the Dark Jedi sometime during the 100-Year Darkness, and quickly made a name for himself as the greatest warrior not of his era. But many said that he was the greatest warrior to ever live. Tulak Hord wore a suit of terrifying armor, and wielded a blade of glory. He went down in the pages of history as a duelist that could annihilate anyone. But why do we think that Tulak Hord was one of the 12 Exiles? In the Golden Age of the Sith issue number 0, we get a flashback of the Dark Jedi arriving on Korriban, one of our few illustrations of it. A figure is seen here in red armor with a lightsaber, clearly shown dominating the Sith people, one of them genuflecting before him. In the KOTOR game, Tulak Hord's helmet is said to be blackened with age, meaning that his armor was not originally black in color. It could have been red, meaning this figure very well could have been the one and only Tulak Hord. It was stated that Tulak Hord fought with the Jedi on the Battle of Balmorra, a planet explicitly stated to have been a battleground during the 100-Year Darkness. It's not possible for a second battle to have happened on Balmorra, as only one skirmish has ever been recorded anywhere prior to the Great Galactic War, when the Republic fights Vitiate's Empire. He also used crystals within his lightsaber which were from Alderaan and Rafa 5. These were two planets that were in Republic space, meaning Tulak Hord claimed the crystals in Republic territory. And to reiterate, Hord was said to be the greatest of all ancient Sith lightsaber masters. Yet only the Gen Jedi ever used lightsabers. The Sith Lords after them during the Golden Age, Marka Ragnos, Naga Sadow, Ludo Kresh, they all used enchanted metal swords. Tulak Hord was absolutely one of the 12. Moving on at 7, we have another one of my favorites, Darth Andeddu. Carrying the reputation of having been the very first Darth, Andeddu was another ancient Sith Lord that is not explicitly stated to have been an exile, but there is a staggering amount of evidence that makes it impossible for him not to have been one. He had been born on the world of Prakith, and did in fact use a lightsaber as well. He was also known to the Jedi, as they had attempted to purge all mention of his name throughout the galaxy, including their archives, the exact same way they had tried to do with the other 12. It's extremely important to mention that the Jedi didn't have any records of other ancient Sith Lords until after Naga Sadow's defeat in the Great Hyperspace War. Although this is skipping ahead in the timeline, we wanted to mention this as a part of our evidence. He fled to Prakith because his enemies tried to kill him for his knowledge. And as Ajunta said, we desired each other's secrets. Andeddu also ruled Prakith for several hundred years after this, but was extremely paranoid that his enemies would soon find him. So he built a tomb around himself, surrounded by his secrets, in order to protect all of his knowledge. He would not have needed to feel afraid of his enemies after so many centuries, unless those enemies, too, had the power of immortality, which we established that the Dark Jedi did through alchemy. If this isn't enough, he was familiar with Karness Muur, as we mentioned in many of the scrolls found in his tomb, knowledge which was lost by the time of Naga Sadow. Karness and Andeddu had been friends. Given this evidence, and a big piece of evidence that we'll be mentioning in just a moment, it is impossible for Andeddu to not have been anything other than one of the original 12. But let's talk about what he did. Andeddu was the one who pioneered the title of Darth. Just like how the ancient Sith purebloods came across holocron technology from the Rakata, it appears that the Exiles took something else from the Infinite Empire: their language. Some historians see Darth as a corruption of Daritha, the Rakatan word for emperor. However, others note that the word for triumph or conquest in Rakata is Dar, the word for death is Ta. This has led to theories that over time, that Darth is derived from Dartha, meaning triumph over death, or in other words, immortal. Andeddu gave himself the title of the Immortal God King, and it would make sense that he would be the one to put word to immortal, calling himself Darth, boasting that he had triumphed over death. But now we get to a really fun part of the video: the really obscure members of the 12. This lore is already obscure in itself, but this is going really deep. We reach number 8, Broodica. Despite being officially named, Broodica is the exile that we know the least about. There doesn't exist any knowledge of what she looked like, what species she may have been. But what we do know of Broodica is only because of what is mentioned from others, as well as an obscure source book, which offhandedly mentions her as one of the co-founders of the Sith Empire, and places her among the other exiles. Similarly to Sorzus Syn, Broodica was obsessed with books and scrolls found throughout Korriban, and studied them intensively. She was fascinated by the power that they contained within them, and would record her findings. But rather than using a holocron, Broodica instead crafted a personal grimoire, and kept her knowledge protected with a lock of her own design. The lock resembled the function of a holocron gatekeeper. It is unknown why she didn't make a holocron, but our best guess is that she appreciated the physical medium of recording information more. But Broodica is officially the last of the named Dark Jedi exiles that we could find, leaving numbers 9 through 12 unknown. 9 through 12, the throne figures. The final 4 exiles are unnamed. It seems that Sorzus Syn was correct in presuming that they were only distinguished because they hadn't perished in the Battle of Korbos. In fact, we only ever see them once, when the resurrected Palpatine visits their tomb for help. Palpatine, trapped in his very last clone body, returns to the Valley of the Dark Lords of Korriban, and visits the tomb of the throne figures. Within the Grand Necropolis, there are many stone thrones which contain the mummified remains of the Sith Lords themselves. Palpatine explains this: these mummified ancients are preserved by the very alchemy that made them outcasts. The dark alchemy that kept the Jedi going began to mummify them while they were still alive. Hence why Andeddu looks like an undead skeleton in many of his depictions. A curse. The 4 throne figures may have been taking their places among the thrones, and simply allowed their physical flesh to decay, allowing their spirits to run rampant in their tomb. We do have some images that depict what the throne figures looked like in life. There is a recording in the Old Republic data files which shows the Dark Jedi on Korriban. In the image, we see exactly 3 men that do not resemble any of the main exiles standing among the Sith people. And in Sorzus Syn's journal, she had a chart demonstrating the hierarchy of their empire. At the very top, she drew an unnamed bald human Dark Jedi in black armor, and coupled with the 3 other exiles that we have in this single image, these are likely the 4 throne figures that Palpatine visits. So now that we've all been officially introduced to them, what exactly did the 12 do? What was their reign like during the Sith Empire? After Ajunta Pall beheaded Hakagam Grosh and was recognized as their leader, all of the Dark Jedi became his shadow hands. Interestingly, we're not told if they had any specific kind of hierarchy. We're left to believe that they had an uneasy understanding of being equal to one another, all beneath Ajunta Pall's rule. But anyone who's familiar with the ways of the Sith will know that this is a recipe for disaster. But for now, they seem to be largely keeping out of each other's way, focusing on building the Empire. They were wounded after all. Sorzus Syn writes that they took note of the fact that the Sith purebloods, at least at one point in time, had an empire that spanned across several conquered worlds. They observed this from noting a myriad of slave species from many different worlds on Korriban. The 12 then took the Builder's Caste, calling them the Zaguruk, and redirected their construction efforts to crafting more starships and less burial mounds. With this, the Sith achieved a fleet of their own rather than having to rely on creaking galleon that they had arrived in. From here, Ajunta, Syn, and Dreypa worked together to discover the rest of Sith space. They began with the 5 sacred Sith planets which ran along the Nache-Belphia hyperlane: Ziost, Cardelba, Relg, Crayus, and Korriban. Having finally departed the sandy tomb world, the 12 found themselves on the world of Ziost. the ancient throne world of King Adus. There, the Dark Lords erected their own palaces to rule the people, atop a precarious cliff with the citadel which had once served as a building to represent the capital of the Sith. The 12 rebuilt it as the Citadel of Ajunta Pall, establishing it as neutral ground and a meeting place for all of the lords to convene as a Sith council under the one Dark Lord. During this time, they also refounded Ashas Re and Roman Kos. Syn notes that the Sith had once reached other worlds outside of the Stygian caldera, so the Overlords also visited and established Malachor and Thule, as fortifying the defenses of Sith space was paramount to them. The world of Tund became a prison for heretics. Arura housed monsters spawned from Sith alchemy. Now, things were starting to look like an actual empire. The first 2 years of the 12's rule was nothing but discovery and expansion. All the while, each of them grew in power as they discovered more and more secrets of the ancients. And now, we have reached part 3, the Secret Apocalypse. At long last, we have reached the point in history that the journals of Sorzus Syn fall eerily quiet. This was because tensions finally broke between the Gen Jedi, and their first big conflict occurred. It was the opinion of Remulus Dreypa that their forces and powers had grown significantly in their 2-year exile. He was done waiting, and through with complacency. Desiring to expand their empire in the galaxy at last, he approached Ajunta Pall with a plan, demanding that now was the time to take all they had built, to return to the Republic with a vengeance, to destroy the Jedi. Sorzus Syn sided with Remulus in this opinion, but we believe that she didn't want war with the Jedi, but she wanted something else. In her writing, she makes her growing dissatisfaction with the Junta's leadership clear with every single page. She had plans of overthrowing him herself and taking his mantle. Seeing Remulus as a strong enough banner to rally behind, she took his side. Ajunta was not keen on the idea of returning to the Republic, believing that it was too soon. But there was still much more that they could uncover. Ajunta believed that they had founded an empire that was beyond anything the Republic had ever seen, but they still needed to finish building it. We can assume that Tulak Hord sided with Ajunta, along with Karness Muur, though he likely only did so as an opportunity to finally have an excuse to openly fight his rival. As for the allegiance of the other exiles, the history is unfortunately silent on this, but it's possible that they stayed out of the fight completely. This conflict was quick and brutal, with little to no information on what exactly happened specifically. But we do know that this is where Sorzus Syn would eventually meet her end. Interestingly, unlike several of the others, she never had a tomb, only an empty throne among the throne figures seen in the Empire's End comic. Not even her remains were placed in that throne, possibly indicating that she had attempted to kill Ajunta Pall, but was then destroyed so completely by him that there was nothing of her left to bury. Unfortunately for Karness Muur, his plans for taking out his rival ended in disaster, as Remulus outsmarted him. Karness Muur had used the dark side of the Force to create an old oubliette in order to trap Remulus within. Karness Muur had him in a corner. He knew that the amulet that Karness had would allow his spirit to live on, allowing him to survive in some fashion. So Remulus designed a stasis chamber to keep him for all eternity. The history gets a bit muddied here, as we don't know exactly how Karness Muur died. Some accounts claim that he was assassinated by Remulus before the plan could take action. Others say that he was trapped inside of the oubliette, simply poured his spirit within the talisman, allowing his body to die. Either way, Karness Muur's spirit was now inside of his amulet and talisman, and it would be lost to the histories for the next several thousand years. But Karness Muur was still technically alive. Baron Remulus Dreypa would take his minions and would leave Sith space, heading back to the Republic to take his own long-awaited revenge. However, around this time, Jedi veterans from the 100-Year Darkness were patrolling that area of space. These Jedi didn't believe that simply banishing the Dark Jedi was a fitting enough punishment for what they had done, and it didn't sit right with them that they got to skip the death penalty, and they had spent a century killing and destroying countless lives. These Jedi took it upon themselves to find these fallen brothers, and enact what they saw as righteous judgment upon them. It was then that they would run straight into Remulus's forces in space. They had found their old enemy. With no time to call for help, the Jedi Patrol engaged them, and they would do battle with the Sith fleet across the galaxy, until both armadas found themselves on the world known as Kesh. Their battle ended with the Sith and the Jedi crash landing on Kesh, where they found a forested paradise with only inhabitants of a primitive nature. Purple-toned people known as the Kishiri The Jedi and Sith continued their fighting on the surface of the world. Due to the peculiar magnetic atmosphere of the planet, which interrupted all transmissions, neither side was able to call for reinforcements or even let anyone else know that they were out there. This, along with the planet's lack of natural metals, left both parties essentially stranded. They then pressed on with their war, wrecking the natural environment of Kesh with their weapons, and inadvertently causing the deaths of thousands of the Kashiri people, innocents caught in the crossfire. The devastation and the death toll was so catastrophic that it threatened to cause a mass extinction of all the native life. In a moment that can only be described as miraculous, both the Jedi and the Sith minions of Remulus Dreypa came to their senses, realized what they were doing to the planet around them. They looked with their own eyes at almost total annihilation, staring death in the face. This is what they caused, and they were deeply disturbed by it. It was said that even the fallen Jedi, the Sith, for all of their depravity, saw the truth. They ceased hostilities at once, with the Jedi agreeing to reconcile with their brethren, and the Dark Jedi in turn coming back from the brink of the dark side, agreeing to seal away their leader forever, whom they called their greatest weapon. Remulus, for all of his power as a Sith Lord, was no match for dozens upon dozens of Jedi and Force-powered minions all ganging up on him at a single moment. They used their combined forces to seal one of the 12 away in some kind of oubliette, fittingly, the one that the Baron had designed to lock away Karness Muur and to bury him in the sands of Korriban. This was now his own tomb. But let's go back in Sith space. Things weren't exactly sunshine and roses for those that had sided with Ajunta. In one conflict, a significant portion of their number had been taken out instantaneously. Karness Muur, Remulus Dreypa, Sorzus Syn, they were all gone. 3 of the most distinguished members and founding members of the Sith, and their loss was being felt. This one conflict over whether or not to return to the Republic meant far more than just a disagreement. The Gen Jedi had been living in a tense agreement of mutual peace and respect, but now that line had been crossed, and the truce was broken forever. An unknown amount of time would pass, as all the Sith Lords now lived with an eye over their shoulder. We currently do not know if Ajunta Pall's leadership lasted a few more months, or even centuries, but soon, the tension would indeed break again. When the spirit of Ajunta Pall spoke to Revan, he mentioned that they became jealous of one another, and came to desire specifically each other's secrets. It's possible that these are just generalized feelings of envy for one another's power, or it could be that they are now reaching the end of their life's rope, using alchemy, and they required a new method of immortality. To this end, they finally turned on one another. Their greatest fear was at their doorstep, death itself. What remained of the 12 was thrown into conflict, tearing them asunder with a final critical blow. It appears as if Darth Andeddu was the first target. Per his name Death, he had discovered the method of essence transfer which had led to immortality, and as the story of Andeddu goes, he faked his death and flees the world of Korriban. His talents were never in combat. Sorzus Syn didn't think that he was distinguished enough in that aspect to even mention him, but he was very good at deception. Using magic, he made it appear as though he was dead when Ajunta Pall murdered him. He even had his own tomb built on Korriban before he hopped in his ship and took a hyperlane directly from Sith space into the deep core, returning to his homeworld of Prakith. Eventually though, the other remaining members of the 12 discovered his deception and searched relentlessly for Andeddu and his secret. But unfortunately to them, Andeddu was gone. The hyperlanes leading to the deep core ended up collapsing in on themselves, cutting it off for the rest of the galaxy for a millennia. Unfortunately for us, XoXaan's death is not told to us, but I believe that she died pretty soon following. She manages to hide her holocron away within her tomb, which was little more than an unremarkable structure with a small nook in it. She had her tomb built to be less impressive than the others as not to draw attention to it. This worked out perfectly, as her holocron was one of the few that was not discovered at all, by Jedi or Sith alike. However, she also died very quickly after doing this. In truth, XoXaan never stood a chance. 2 of her remaining opponents were the greatest lightsaber duelists that the galaxy had ever seen, and she was likely killed by either Tulak or Ajunta. As for Broodica, her remains remain completely unknown, but she most likely died here as well. But the ending of the war was a single, dramatic duel between 2 of the greatest warriors of their time. A duel for the mantle of the Dark Lord. This was between Tulak Hord and Ajunta Pall. Tulak and Ajunta faced off against one another, the unstoppable armored powerhouse versus the father of the Sith. Tulak Hord reigned supreme. apparently murdering Ajunta with his own sword. According to Ajunta himself, his warblade betrayed him. This is honestly completely poetic. This was the same warblade that Ajunta had taken from the Sith King Hakagam Grosh in order to behead him with it. And thus, the 12 were now one, and Tulak Hord became the Dark Lord of the Sith. The mantle passed to him, making Tulak Hord the second Dark Lord in all of the lore. But their stories are not over here quite yet. Each one has a legacy that would survive them thousands of years past their own death, as what they did in life echoed across the galaxy. These were the first Sith after all, and that is why we have titled Chapter 4, Legacy. Beginning of course with our reigning Dark Lord Tulak Hord, who was still living. He went on to reign as the Dark Lord of the Sith for several hundred years. He took on an apprentice of his own by the name of Ortan Sella, desiring to pass on the teachings of the Gen Jedi to the next generation of Sith. At some point, he would be challenged to an honorable duel against a Dashad assassin by the name of Kem Val. The Dashad were a terrifying powerful race of Hulks with a natural affinity towards combat and the dark side. These ancient creatures were known to literally consume the energy of Force sensitives that they defeated in combat, and most notably, they ate Sith Lords. However, Tulak Hord would defeat Kem Val in this duel, and the Dark Lord admired the Dashad's power and fighting capabilities, so he chose to spare his life. But he offered him one condition, that Kem Val would be his servant. Tulak Hord even promised the Dashad that he would soon eat his fill of Force-sensitive blood and flesh. Kem pledged a life debt to Tulak Hord and became the most loyal and devoted follower of the Sith Lord. Tulak made good on his promise, gathering up the forces of the Sith Empire and doing what Remulus Dreypa had wanted to do years earlier. Tulak Hord attacked the now unaware Republic. Sometime prior to the year 5300 BBY, Tulak Hord formally announced war on the Republic. Interestingly, this is the one war that the Sith are scarcely found in any historical document. But according to the dates of the battles, and even given us to the Old Republic fact files themselves, some kind of secret shadow war happened between the Republic and Tulak Hord's Sith Empire. We have knowledge of just a handful of battles and situations that were ever recorded. One of them was known as the Battle of Yin, and the other was known as the Battle of Kabosh. At the Battle of Yin, the Republic laid siege to the Sith Imperial stronghold. When Kem Val recalls the event, he states that Tulak Hord arrived late, but that he repelled a Republic strike team filled with Jedi and destroyed the Jedi siege single-handedly, alone marching into battle. Hord and Kem Val both fed on their own power, drinking in the energies of all of the fallen Force sensitives. At the Battle of Kabosh, which occurred following the Battle of Yin, Tulak Hord, Kem Val, and Ortan Sella led the Empire, leading them to a huge victory against both the Republic and the rebels alike. It was during this battle that apparently Tulak Hord performed a Sith ritual, drawing in all the strength of the Jedi army into himself. This was the culmination of the knowledge of the 12. Kem Val claims that he saw Tulak Hord personally murder 1,000 Jedi during both of these battles, making this the most impressive war feat that I have ever seen in Star Wars. Truly, he represented a kind of power that has only been granted to the 100-Year Darkness and its veterans. Tulak Hord was forged in war, and this made him the Lord of Hate. Following the battle, the Dark Lord decided that he wanted to place Kem Val somewhere for safekeeping for the time being, and so the Dashad was placed in a stasis chamber within a tomb in the Valley of the Dark Lords. It isn't exactly known why Tulak Hord made this decision, but not having a close ally that he could trust at his side at all times would prove to be a massive mistake. At some point during these battles, Tulak Hord was approached by another Sith Lord by the name of Aloysius Kallig, who sought to serve alongside the Dark Lord. Tulak initially dismissed Kallig outright, until the Sith decided to prove himself by defeating Hord's top general in single combat. He extended the offer again, and this time, Tulak Hord acquiesced. Kallig would go on to lead the Sith armies to several victories, causing Tulak Hord to become very wary of his skill. As Kallig was becoming more and more renowned and loved, it was here that Tulak Hord ordered that he be assassinated. Unfortunately, it wasn't Kallig that Hord needed to be looking out for though, but it was his own apprentice, Ortan Sella. The pathetic coward did not even kill Tulak Hord in an honorable duel. He quite literally stabbed him in the back while he was distracted during the war. Without Tulak Hord's powerful leadership and battle skill, the Sith Empire was beaten back by the Republic following Tulak's death, and they were forced to return to Sith space. It should also be noted that Tulak Hord was likely murdered with the same sword of Hakagam Grosh. The curse continued, as this was the same weapon that Hord had used to kill Ajunta. Tulak Hord is fascinating though, because he's the first Dark Lord of the Sith not to stem from the Jedi Order, being the second. As Tulak was never formally a Jedi, he simply rallied to the cause of the Dark Jedi during the 100-Year Darkness, before likely just being a dark side warrior. We aren't entirely sure how his apprentice Orton Sella died, but we do know that he was eventually succeeded by the great Marka Ragnos, a fitting ruler who had the claim to the throne of the Dark Lord as a direct descendant of Ajunta Pall. Tulak Hord was taken back to Korriban, where she was then laid to rest in his tomb. Along with his body were laid several of his writings, his lightsaber crystal, his holocron, and his now black mask. However, much of the histories of Tulak Hord were lost when the Jedi invaded Korriban following the Great Hyperspace War. Like many other Sith artifacts and records, the Jedi Order looted or destroyed them in an effort to purge the evil of the Sith from the galaxy and from Korriban. And while Tulak Hord's tomb itself remained intact, traps were placed to keep looters away and to test the worth of any knowledge-seeking Darksiders. By the time of the Jedi Civil War, the redeemed Revan had entered the tomb of Tulak Hord, successfully navigating its traps and discovering the Sith Lord's mask. It's possible that he took it with him when he departed, but this isn't the end of Tulak Hord's legacy. Tulak Hord's lightsaber was discovered on the world of Drumund Fell by Darth Marr. And while Tulak didn't seem to survive as a spirit, several recordings of him did, along with several artifacts that he had owned during his life. Many claim these artifacts were crafted by Sorzus Syn, others directly by the hand of Tulak Hord. But what's interesting though is how the past reconnects here. A descendant of Tulak Hord's only rival in Darth Calig, Darth Nox, would go on a quest to find each one of Tulak Hord's artifacts, beginning his quest during the Great Galactic War. Moving on with legacies, let's talk about Broodica. Unfortunately, she doesn't appear anywhere else in the lore, but her temple did survive for a while. As for the throne figures, it was said that they ruled for hundreds of years, which meant that they too outlived Ajunta Pall. It seems that they swore fealty to Tulak Hord, and were allowed to continue living under him as long as they did not challenge him, while other records suggest that they were murdered in the final great battle between Ajunta and Tulak. Their mummified remains were placed in their thrones, likely by loyal servants of theirs, and as we mentioned before, Sidious would later visit them in his final clone body, looking for help. The throne figures greeted Sidious, and didn't understand why he wanted to continue. They would go on to say that the empty throne in their midst had originally been intended for Darth Vader, who they thought could be the Sithari, but now they offered it to Sidious. He could join them forever in their spiritual rule. Sidious rejected this and demanded a solution to his problem with life. And so the throne figures acquiesced to his request and showed him where he could find Leia's child to possess it and transfer his essence. But what about the legacy of Ajunta? Ajunta was one of several of the Gen Jedi that did survive as a Sith spirit. However, he wandered his tomb for centuries in despair. As the years turned to centuries, and the centuries to millennia, Ajunta's memories of his life began to fade. All he was now was grief. All he had was sadness over his life, and he had come to severely regret ever turning to the dark side. The memory of killing and betraying his Jedi Master was the only one clear in his mind. When Revan found him, the spirit of Ajunta gave an abbreviated history of himself and his colleagues, though there was a significant amount of gaps in his memory at the time. When he learned from Revan that the Sith were still alive and wreaking havoc across the stars, and had been for thousands of years, the spirit of Ajunta Pall wailed in sadness. He called all of the Sith fools and hoped that they would never return. By the end of his miserable existence, Ajunta fully understood the irony and the trap of the dark side. It offers immense power in the immediate, but takes so much from you in the end, even yourself. Ajunta describes how powerful he thought he had become, and how foolishly proud he was. And yet, the Sith destroyed each other for their secrets, never content with any power that they had. The only thing that Ajunta Pall could think about was how he desperately wanted his master to forgive him. Luckily, the Jedi Revan spoke compassionately about him, and Revan encouraged Ajunta to forgive himself, to embrace the calls of the light side that were now clear. Finally, Ajunta Pall, the father of the Sith Order, accepted the light side of the Force once again, and passed on peacefully. 4,000 years after being put in stasis though, one of the 12 would awaken. Baron Dreypa was released from his prison on Kesh. During this time, the original coalition of his minions and the Jedi had come together to form a new group that they called the Doomed. Out of penance for what they had done to the Kashiri people, they had come to hate the Force within themselves and devoted their descendants to always guarding what they called the weapon, which of course was Remulus. Now in that time, more Sith had arrived on this world. They had been a supply ship filled with the followers of Naga Sadow's Sith Empire, and had come during the Great Hyperspace War. When these Sith crashed, they found that they could not escape either, and so, taking after the original 12, they established themselves as gods to the Kashiri people. By now, the war between the Jedi and Remulus Dreypa's minions had become a myth to the Kashiri, wherein the gods that they called the Guardians and the Destroyers battled each other long ago for dominance. The Sith who had now landed had no knowledge of the Doomed, and so decided to take advantage of this legend, telling the Kashiri that they were the Guardians. For the next 1,000 years, they formed themselves into what is known as the Lost Tribe of the Sith, and ruled the world of Kesh, completely ignorant of the Doomed, or Dreypa's presence on the world. This was until two people from the Lost Tribe of the Sith, Takara Hiltz and Spinner, found the Doomed, and their now old civilization. The cowardly and untalented Spinner attempted to seize power for himself by claiming what they called the weapon, believing it to be a literal weapon. However, when he broke open the oubliette, he was greeted by Remulus Dreypa, awake and hungry for vengeance. Remulus wasted no time, and he began massacring what he called pathetic Sith pretenders. He sensed that they had the dark side within them, but it was a partial understanding. The Lost Tribe was nothing compared to the might of the original Sith, and he intended to show all of them that. With his spellbinding words, Remulus Dreypa shouted out a speech of glory, inspiring a slave revolt. Within about an hour of awakening, Remulus Dreypa had already gathered himself an army and a loyal follower in the form of Spinner. Meanwhile, the other Sith, Takara, the princess of the Lost Tribe, was working with a member of the Doomed to find a way to stop Remulus. One thing was working in their advantage. The Sith Lord's memories were hazy from awakening after such a long sleep, but as he went along his conquest of Kesh, he began to remember what he was after: the Leviathans that he stole from Sorzus Syn. He had kept them in Kesh's volcano for safekeeping. The Lost Tribe initially didn't take him very seriously though, as they had no idea who he was. They thought that he was just an average Sith. They had no idea that he was one of the original Gen Jedi. But that would change quickly when he used his amulet to summon the sleeping Leviathans out of the volcano. Because the Leviathans were under his control, any power or memories they absorbed would go directly to him. So as he commanded them to attack and kill the Lost Tribe of the Sith as well as the Doomed, he quickly gained memories of all the time that he had lost, which informed him of the only known space-worthy vessel lost on Kesh, one that was now protected by the Doomed. Now, Spinner saw his madness and ultimately betrayed Remulus, working with the Princess of the Lost Tribe again in order to keep him from leaving the world and wreaking havoc on the galaxy. The two Sith Lords would then find the ship, aptly named the Last Hope, and would use its guns to destroy the last of Remulus's Leviathans. To keep a long story short, the final battle would happen on the Last Hope, as Remulus battled the two of them for control over the ship. Neither one of them were any match for him whatsoever, neither at the blade, and certainly not with the Force. But the Sith were able to distract him long enough to put the ship on autopilot and descend its course directly into the volcano. Takara and Spinner jumped overboard as the Last Hope was sent careening into the mountain, giving Remulus Dreypa a violent and a fiery death. But what of XoXaan? XoXaan's spirit remained within her tomb until she was awakened by the arrival of a Jedi, or at least a former one, by the name of Asherad Het. Het was now a bounty hunter and had chased one of his bounties to Korriban. Asherad was already on a path of darkness after losing everything near to him following Order 66, and then being abandoned by his Tusken tribe after he was defeated by Obi-Wan. He was lost and was giving into his anger. He chased down his bounty, wanting to satiate his bloodlust. The bounty now meant nothing to him. Asherad did not want money or reward. He wanted vengeance. And it was here where he heard the ghostly voice from a small tomb. And within the tomb, he found a hidden chamber containing a Sith holocron. Upon touching it, the spirit of XoXaan appeared. She explained who she was, and how she had abandoned the Jedi Order following a darker path, telling Asherad Het that it was herself and her colleagues who pioneered what it actually meant to be a Sith Lord. She expressed that her knowledge and presence had been hidden in the temple for ages. XoXaan was waiting for the perfect opportunity to take on a true apprentice of her own, one who she had wanted to have served the light before and found it lacking. Someone who knew true anger, hate, and now despair. This reveals that XoXaan didn't want to teach someone who grew up knowing the dark side only, but specifically wanted an apprentice that was once a Jedi. XoXaan wanted to relate with them, relate to their mind. She could fashion them into a being just as powerful as the original Gen Jedi had been. This was her goal, and so she very eagerly extended her offer to one Asherad Het, whom she sensed as being the perfect apprentice. Het would accept her teachings, calling her master, and deciding to learn from the dark side. This laid the foundation of how Het would become Darth Krayt. This creates an interesting set of circumstances, and maybe why Krayt was so different from any other Sith Lord. He was stronger, wiser, and actually had a goal in mind. This was because Darth Krayt learned exactly what it meant to be a Sith Lord from its source, from one who actually created the Order. Krayt didn't want power for power's sake. He wanted to make the galaxy secure the way that the Jedi could not. And for this, XoXaan was the perfect master. She would train Darth Krayt for literal decades within her temple. Whenever Asherad finally emerged, the war with the Empire was over, and Luke Skywalker had triumphed over Vader and the Emperor, the Sith. And Asherad Het had not yet realized all the time that had passed, but he was now armed with the true meaning of Sithdom. He had learned from its source. But what of the fate of Darth Andeddu? After fleeing from Korriban, he took a hyperlane all the way into Deep Core, back to Prakith. There he established a great kingdom in his honor, and begat a cult that he named the Malevolence. He trained this cult to use the dark side, but they weren't nearly as strong as the Sith Empire was. His followers came to revere him though as their God King, an immortal being whom they believed would forever reign supreme. The collapse of hyperspace lanes which led to Prakith resulted in the isolation of its inhabitants, and allowed the Dark Lord to maintain unfettered dominion over the deep core. However, paranoia caused Andeddu to still believe that his enemies would eventually arrive to steal his lore, and all of his knowledge, and he entombed himself, surrounded by his books and scrolls. Andeddu was okay with the idea that he would carry his secrets with him long into death. But his deceptions were not over. He would make his tomb a labyrinthian structure with a false burial chamber. It was there that he put his holocron. Andeddu wanted the holocron to be convincing enough to satisfy the curiosity of anyone looking, any would-be robbers, so that they wouldn't delve deeper into his real chamber. His sarcophagus, with his physical remains, and the library stayed hidden for thousands of years after his passing. Meanwhile, Andeddu's Malevolence cult continued to immerse themselves in the dark side, maintaining worship of their God King. Andeddu mandated that they guard his tomb and fortress, patiently waiting for the day that he would resurrect himself and lead them once more. At some point, once the hyperlanes to the deep core reopened, Naga Sadow would be the one to travel to Prakith and learn the secret of Darth Andeddu's essence transfer, but Naga Sadow never used it. However, he did make a recording of Andeddu's existence, the only recording of its kind. That same recording would eventually find its way into the hands of Darth Bane after the very beginning of the Rule of Two. Bane would make a perilous journey to Prakith himself, where he effortlessly fought off the pitiful resistance offered by the Malevolence cult, astounded that the cult was still alive. He then traversed to the tomb directly, until he too found the false burial chamber and Andeddu's false holocron. It was here where he would find the real holocron, and the secret to essence transfer, leaving Prakith never knowing where all of the ancient Sith Lord's real knowledge remained. Even Bane could not find it. Andeddu had hid it too well. It was his life's mission after all. Darth Bane would apparently take the holocron with him though, and following Bane's death, it would find its way back to Korriban. During the Clone Wars, the holocron of Andeddu would be found by Dooku, who gifted Andeddu's red crystal to the then dark side allegiant Quinlan Vos. The real burial chamber of Andeddu would not be discovered until one of Darth Krayt's most loyal followers, Darth Warlock, discovered it in the year 137 ABY. At the time, Krayt was suffering from a terrible illness that threatened to consume and kill him, and none of the other Sith holocrons, including Darth Bane's, were willing to help him or share the secret to immortality, so he had to send his best man to grab it straight from the source. Warlock spoke to the holocron gatekeeper of Andeddu and convinced it to tell him where to find the real burial chamber. The gatekeeper of Andeddu found it to be an interesting test of Warlock's abilities, so he told him where to find Prakith, assuming the Sith could not survive the trials. It was likely that the gatekeeper was aware that Andeddu's actual spirit still lived and held real power. Unfortunately though, the gatekeeper vastly underestimated Warlock's own power in the dark side. Upon arrival to Andeddu's keep on Prakith, Warlock was greeted by what was left of the cult malevolence, untrained rats living in squalor and still devoted to the dark side. Warlock mocked them before effortlessly murdering them in a grand display of a true Sith's power. He cast an illusion upon all of them so that it would appear as though their brethren were clones of himself. This caused the cult to start slaughtering one another out of panic, only realizing the truth once they had killed their own. With a single burst of force lightning, Warlock dispatched the rest of them and forced the sole survivor to take him to the real chamber of Andeddu. He made the holocron speak the passcode to open the burial chamber, and the gatekeeper instructed Warlock to place the holocron in the creator's chest. However, Warlock was no fool and decided to study Andeddu's books first. However, when he was not looking, the last member of the cult snatched the holocron and placed it on his dead master's remains in order to complete the ritual. Andeddu's mummified remains awoke, and he sucked out the life energy of the final cultist, allowing him to regain the life that he needed to rise once more. As Andeddu sprung to life, he began a duel with Darth Warlock, not with lightsabers though, but with the Force and with the mind. Andeddu tossed Warlock around, cast a powerful illusion to make it seem as though the ground beneath him were a volcanic wasteland filled with fire, lava, and death. All the while he mocked Warlock for being subservient to another, to Crate, something a true Sith Lord would never allow. But Warlock had enough, and resisted Andeddu's power, calling out that he saw was nothing more than the same kind of illusion that he had once used on the cultist, a trick. Warlock then began to call out Andeddu as a coward, stating that he sensed nothing but fear within him. Warlock turned Andeddu's illusion against him, playing on his own paranoia. He made it seem as though he were using the fires of Andeddu to conjure and burn all of his books, scrolls, knowledge. Andeddu screamed out in terror as he saw his knowledge burned before him, and his own worst fear literally destroyed him. His fear ripped him apart. The lifeless husk of Andeddu's corpse fell to the floor, defeated at last. Warlock then gathered the knowledge that he found as useful, and left the fortress for good. The slimy Karness Muur would be among one of the last of the 12 to die. Karness Muur technically actually survived the longest. Naga Sadow, who was obsessed with the lore of the Gen Jedi, had attempted in vain to locate the Muur talisman. Unfortunately, it had been lost to his day, but it wasn't until the year 3,963 years before the Battle of Yavin, during the Mandalorian Wars, that the talisman would be brought back to the galaxy. Somehow, it wasn't Sith nor Jedi that found it first, but it was the Mandalorians. In fact, their chief scientist had used its power to turn the Mandalorian enemies into an army of blaster-wielding Rakghouls under his command. A group of Jedi seers called the Covenant had terrifying visions of Karness Muur's return, and so they dispatched the Jedi agent Celeste Moore to locate the talisman. She, along with the fellow Jedi Zane Carrick, would encounter the Mandalorian scientist on the world of Jebel. When they found the Mandalorian, they discovered that they had gone absolutely mad from the power of the artifact. Zane would be captured by the scientist, and when held in the laboratory, he found another terrifying discovery. He saw that the Mandalorians had uncovered another artifact, the oubliette of Remulus Dreypa, or at least one of them. But upon sensing a strong force sensitive nearby, the Muur talisman abandoned the Mandalorian scientist and attempted to possess Zane, wanting a master of the Force. It had been Karness's plan all along to possess a powerful force sensitive with his amulet. However, in that moment, Celeste arrived and managed to pull the talisman off of Zane. The amulet instead, though, latched itself onto her as she saw Karness Muur's spirit with her very eyes. Still alive, now under his spell, Celeste took his hand and became temporarily under his influence. Using her new command of the Rakghoul army, she defeated the Mandalorians and began to conquer the entire world of Jebel. It was clear that she was preparing to unleash the Rakghoul plague on the entire galaxy, to put trillions under the command of Karness Muur. Zane, though, helped her to eventually see the influence of the amulet, allowing her to temporarily regain control. When she learned that she was a danger to everyone with the amulet, she requested that Zane kill her. But instead, Zane decided the best thing to do was to place her in the stasis pod that he remembered the Mandalorian scientist had. That way, he could preserve her body until they could find a way to neutralize the amulet, and no harm would come to her as a result of her being frozen. Unfortunately though, Zane would get quite busy during the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War, and left poor Celeste still in the oubliette, all but forgotten by the Jedi. It was here where Karness would grow to severely regret possessing the Jedi, as she would go on to effectively serve as his prison for a very, very long time. For 4,000 years, Karness Muur and Celeste were suspended together within the oubliette. It was soon found by miners though, and sold to smugglers. Eventually though, Celeste was found and awoken from her long slumber by none other than Darth Vader. The Jedi learned that not only did the Mandalorians not succeed in the war, but the galaxy was under the control of a new incarnation of the Sith. Karness Muur was absolutely delighted when he saw Vader as the perfect embodiment of the individual he needed to possess. Vader was the perfect puppet. Celeste, though, attacked Vader as the two dueled. The spirit of Karness Muur attempted to goad Celeste into giving up, dying, or surrendering the talisman to the Dark Lord. She refused though, fighting off his influence as she knew what power Vader would wield if he possessed it. She could sense him too. At the time, Karness Muur was hissing in Vader's ear, giving him visions of defeating Sidious, using the power of the talisman to subjugate the galaxy. However, Vader also refused the offer, knowing that if he accepted, he would only take the talisman to wield its power, but in turn, would be exchanging one master for another, one pair of chains for another. Celeste was then defeated and disarmed by Vader, but she finally used the power of the amulet to turn all the stormtroopers present into Rakghouls under her command. With her army of monsters, she forced Vader to flee the world, where she then would stay in isolation, keeping Karness Muur's talisman and his spirit within her. The spirit of Karness Muur was absolutely furious that the Jedi had managed to use his power, but not only that, he remained imprisoned by her on this desert, desolate moon. For 20 years, Celeste remained stranded there, while Karness Muur gradually drove her insane with whispers. She would attempt to bring Imperials to the moon, where they would then crash land so that she could turn them into Rakghouls. For the time being, she was almost completely given over to the talisman's power once more. Soon though, the Rebel Alliance, including Luke Skywalker and Leia, would find the moon and encountered her vast army of monsters there. Karness Muur sensed the power of the Skywalker twins present, and entrusted Celeste to bring him to them so that he could possess them with the amulet. Celeste and Luke would enter a duel, her mind completely gone now, or at least on the surface. But the novice Luke Skywalker was no match for the Old Republic Jedi, especially one who had learned to master the dark side. She easily bested him, and Celeste said that she was even disgusted by the Skywalker's lack of skill. She demanded to know who he was, whether he was an agent of Vader or a Jedi healer that Zane had promised would come. With Karness Muur hissing in her ear, she felt abandoned and betrayed, even now by the Jedi. In this moment, Leia saved her brother, and Muur figured out that they were strong force sensitive since they were immune to the Rakghoul plague. Karness Muur leapt off of Celeste's necklace and tried to take Luke, but Leia jumped in front of him, and the talisman latched onto her instead. For the first time in thousands of years, Celeste's thoughts were now her own. Everything was finally quiet, and she was free, no longer having to bear the incessant whispering of the ancient Dark Lord. However, she panicked because now the silence was overbearing. She had gotten used to Karness Muur's whisper that now she felt that she would actually lose herself without it. The crushing realization that everything she knew and loved was now gone, that it was in the distant past, was too much for her to bear. She was completely alone in the galaxy, especially now that the Jedi were gone as well. As she looked at Leia struggling with the talisman, she realized that Karness Muur was her burden to bear, and no one should have to suffer as she had. With her lightsaber, she struck at the amulet, knocking it off of Leia and putting it back on her neck instead, accepting her lot as the jailer of Karness Muur. With that, she issued one final warning to Luke Skywalker that his past and future was filled with darkness, and with that, she force-pushed him away, walking away from him and using the rebel ships to venture out into the galaxy. The next time we see Celeste and the Myr Talisman was another 140 years later, into what is known as the Legacy Era. Celeste captured the Star Destroyer known as the Iron Sun, transforming its entire crew into Rakghouls, and took it into a fractured hyperspace lane in the deep core. Karness and Celeste were quite familiar with one another now. Myr continued to ceaselessly pester the Jedi into giving in, but her will was ironclad. However, Karness Muur had become quite patient, and he knew someone else would be looking, or someone would come along. They always did. And he was proven right when another Skywalker came. Cade Skywalker, Luke's direct descendant, and his crew came along and found the Iron Sun. They were attacked by Celeste's Rakghouls, and Cade, along with his best friend. Cade and the rest of the crew all came down with the Rakghoul plague, but Cade was able to use a rare force ability, a force healing technique, one that had never been done before, in order to cure the plague and reverse its effects on himself and his friend. After witnessing this, the Old Republic Jedi was so amazed by what she saw that she pledged herself to be his ally and helped him kill Darth Krayt. But Karness Muur was also impressed by Cade Skywalker's power and took great interest in him. At long last, Muur wore down Celeste enough to take full possession of her body. He would then capture Cade Skywalker and send out a transmission to Darth Krayt. He offered the Dark Lord a proposition, stating that they could help one another as he was aware of Krayt's condition and his powers of dark healing, as well as offered to cure him by using alchemy. It always goes back to alchemy. Darth Krayt met Karness Muur and Cade Skywalker as promised, and the two Sith struck up a bargain after Muur proved that he was able to heal the dying Sith. But it was then revealed the whole thing had been a deception by Cade Skywalker and Celeste in order to lure Krayt into a trap. Karness Muur had been playing both sides. He played along with the Jedi's trap so that he could get near to Darth Krayt, but he was now actively fighting Celeste for control so that he could possess Krayt with his amulet. But the more Celeste fought, the more she was becoming one with Karness Muur. Cade realized that she was losing control after she combined her power with Muur in order to kill not only Krayt, but Cade's lover as well, who was now in the way. Unlike Zane Carrick, Cade Skywalker had no problems about acquiescing to Celeste's request to kill her though, and he ran her through with his lightsaber. Celeste's ancient body eventually blew away into ash, leaving only the Myr Talisman behind. The Old Republic Jedi was finally free. At long last though, Karness Muur was able to possess a new host and leapt into Cade's arm. However, Cade was immune to the talisman's corruptive effects simply because he had no desire to use it. In fact, he was using his ability of Shatterpoint to sense its cracks and its flaws in the Force. He poured his power into the talisman, and with one mighty explosion of energy, he destroyed the Myr Talisman forever. And with that, the very last of the 12 Gen Jedi, the Outcasts, the Exiles, the Lords of the Sith, were no more. The only legacy that we haven't covered is that of Sorzus Syn, who was arguably the most important of the Jedi Exiles next to Ajunta. This is because, truthfully, she unfortunately has no real legacy. For all of her research and knowledge of magic and alchemy, she never became a Sith spirit that we know of. Her body was presumably atomized by Ajunta Pall, and so she never had a tomb or resting place either. In fact, the only thing she left behind was the very journal that gave us this information. The journal found its way to the Jedi archives, where Yoda and Mace Windu would make comment in the margins about what she wrote and what she told. But her journal would not always be in the Jedi's hands. Eventually, it would make its way into the possession of Sidious after he raided the temple archives and added his own commentary to the journal, before respectively adding it to the Book of the Sith. The book would reach the end of its journey when it fell into the hands of Grand Master Luke Skywalker, and Luke would be the last to add his own notes. But there is one chilling loose end about Sorzus Syn that has not been tied up, and that, if you remember my friends, is her amulet. She stated that she planned on making 3 talismans. One went to Karness, one went to Remulus, but she had planned a 3rd amulet to be the master of them all. Unfortunately, we do not know if this talisman ever existed, the Talisman of Sorzus Syn, but if it does, there is a very strong possibility that Sorzus Syn survived. This would mean for upwards of 7,000 years, Sorzus Syn is in hiding, waiting for the right opportunity. She could still be out there somewhere, watching galactic events unfold, which is a chilling thought to have indeed. And with that, my friend, the ending of our holocron. This was the origin of evil, the complete history of the 12 Dark Jedi Exiles, those that gave birth to the Sith Order. Surprisingly, they all lasted much longer than we initially thought, and their influence stayed for the majority of the galactic timeline. I love that the Legacy comics include so much about the Exiles, with XoXaan having taught Darth Krayt, and Andeddu meeting his end along with wrapping up Karness Muir's journey, and the journey of the ancient Jedi Celeste Morn. It is poetic that the ending of the Sith would tie all the way back to its beginning. We currently believe that this is the most complete compilation of their lives, influence, that exists in any single medium. The origin of evil. It was not an easy task to compile all of this scattered information into one place. However, we wanted to give credit where credit is due, and throw a special thanks to the forum post by Shay Hublin. Without their help and research, we would have never linked certain events in the 100-Year Darkness, and could have never deciphered that Darth Andeddu and Tulak Hord were actually a part of the 12 Exiles. We absolutely want to thank you for staying this long if you've continued to the end of this holocron, my friends, and watching until the very end of this long video. We love the ancient Sith, and we find the Dark Jedi antiquity to be absolutely fascinating. A lot of this knowledge is given in flashbacks and offhanded references. Something as important as the very inception of the Sith Order feels like it should have been given some real fleshing out. However, we can say that there is a certain reverence that Legends lore gives by keeping so much of it still a mystery. I can say that while it was an intensive process, research for this holocron was extremely fun. Compiling the little bits and pieces of information that change everything that we think we know about the Sith never ceases to be entertaining. If anything, this was the archive's love letter to the ancient Sith, which we will never stop finding interest in. What we'd love to see now is you guys talking about which one of the 12 is your personal favorite, and who would you apprentice under if you were a Sith. And if you enjoyed these longer format videos, please let us know down below, as we are heavily considering making this a more regular occurrence on the channel, and we'll do more deeper dives and long videos if you guys want to see more. But of course, now that the hissing voices of the dark side have quieted, the red glow of the ancient holocrons extinguish, and we just want to say, see you next time, and may the Force be with you.